Alright guys and gals, this is chapter 7, or 6, sorry, The Revolution Within. So in this lecture we're going to be talking about democratizing freedom, religious toleration, defining economic freedom, what the limits of freedom were and liberty, slavery and revolution. We'll be talking about the daughters of liberty. So this first section, we want to talk about and focus on equality being really a stronger component of American freedom after the Revolution. Okay. Now, the American Revolution took three forms. It was a struggle for independence, a phase in a long-term worldwide contest among European empires, and it was a conflict over what kind of nation America would become. Because of its wide property distribution, the absence of a legally established hereditary aristocracy, and its weak established churches, colonial America had the potential to become very democratic. The Revolution really was a catalyst for this potential and allowed a place for political and social struggles to expand the ideas of freedom and to challenge traditional power structures and hierarchies. Now, though the Revolution's leaders were almost all from the American elite and the lower classes didn't really seize the power, this idea of liberty really enforced or livened, I guess you would say, attacks both on British and domestic institutions. The notion of equality had been enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, and it caused many who were in the social order that might have been considered inferior, like women, slaves, free blacks, servants, apprentices, to question the authority of their superiors. Now this is a picture of Abigail Adams, wife to President Adams. This painting was started in 1800 and by Gilbert Stuart, and he told his friend that Adams must have been a perfect Venus. She wrote a very famous letter that we will be looking at in this chapter, in which she reminds her husband, John Adams, to remember the ladies and to remember those who might be considered inferior, to remember those people as they are growing this new country and as he was being administering this new government. Now, by the time the Revolution had ended, the authority of male heads of their household over women and children slave owners was still intact. For free men, however, the Revolution had a very democratic effect, especially in challenging the traditional limitation of political participation just to property owners. Democracy at this time meant many things, including direct rule by the population, which had been considered mob rule, or the mixed constitution of England. But during the Revolution, it came to mean a form of government that served the interests of the people rather than the elite. In the colonies that became states, members of all classes debated universal male suffrage, religious toleration, and even the abolition of slavery. Demands by those militiamen who hadn't had the right to vote for the right to elect their officers and vote in political elections had established a precedent for giving veterans the right to vote. Now this picture, this is the coronation of Louis XIV of France, reveals the splendor of the royal court, also illustrates the world of fixed, unequal classes and social privileges that Americans really defined as the opposite of what we see in this picture. So what's important here to note is that a lot of times we didn't have an exact definition of freedom in the sense that this is what it is, but we had a definition of freedom of this is what it is not. Okay? The Revolution's radicalism was most evident in Pennsylvania, where almost all of the colonial elite had opposed independence. They were afraid that it would cause the rabble to rule and attack their property. Their opposition opened space for pro-independent forces, mainly made up of artisans in the lower class, to organize in these extra-legal groups and militias that would have been led by men of modest means. And we're talking about men like Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, Benjamin Rush, who was a physician. These men criticized property qualifications for voting and office holding. Shortly after independence, the state adopted a new constitution which abolished the governor's office, ended property qualifications for office holding, and concentrated power in a one-house legislature that was elected annually by all men over the age of 21 who paid taxes. It also established public schools and guaranteed free speech. Here we see John Dickinson's copy of the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. You can see on here are his handwritten proposals for changes. Dickinson was one of the more conservative advocates of independence. He felt the new state constitution was far too democratic. He crossed out a provision that all free men should be eligible to hold office, and another declaring the people not bound by laws that did not promote the common good. Now, every state adopted a new constitution during or after the Revolution. Almost all Americans agreed that their state government should be Republican, which meant that the authority should rest on the consent of the governed, and that there would be no king or any kind of hereditary aristocracy established. But Americans disagreed about the form that this Republican government should take in order to best promote the public good. John Adams and others criticized Pennsylvania's one-house legislature as too radical, and they argued that the new constitution should establish governments that reflected the division of society between the wealthy, who they felt should be represented in the legislature's upper house, and the ordinary that should be represented in a lower house. A powerful governor and judiciary would check the ability of one's class to infringe on the rights of the other. Now, every state except Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Georgia established two-house legislatures similar to this, but only Massachusetts gave its governor the power to veto laws passed by the legislature. You can see in these state constitutions that Americans are preferring a strong legislative branch. Now, far more controversial than the structure of the legislature were the limits on voting and office holding. While conservatives tried to restrict these rights to property owners, arguing that men who didn't have property were far too dependent on others to have their own judgment, and radicals such as Thomas Paine wanted to eliminate traditional social ranks. The new state constitution reflected the balance of power between the conservatives and radicals. Southern states such as Virginia and South Carolina were much less democratic, and it allowed the landed gentry, so the men, the elite that owned the land, to control politics by retaining the property qualifications for voting, when they allowed the legislature to elect the governor. The more democratic constitutions moved toward making voting an entitlement rather than a privilege, but they did not establish universal male suffrage. Only Vermont did not require voters to own property or pay taxes. Ultimately, the Revolution greatly expanded voting rights. By the 1780s, except for Virginia, Maryland, and New York, and a large majority of adult white men met voting requirements. Alone among the states, New Jersey in its constitution allowed all inhabitants with property to vote. This allowed women to vote in that state until the vote was restricted to men in 1808, for about 28 years. For women and non-whites, getting the vote would be a much longer process. By the end of the Revolution, freedom and the right to vote and participate in politics had come to mean the same thing. Now, in this next section, we're going to be looking at the expansion of religious liberty after the Revolution and how it reflected this new American ideal of freedom. You can see here in this image from a New York City newspaper lists the numerous churches visible from the New Jersey shore. So you can see in the picture they're numbered. This is a view of the New York skyline, if you will. Shows the diversity of the religions practiced in the city in 1771. This is even before the Revolution. The Revolution also expanded religious freedoms. Although a few colonies such as Rhode Island and Pennsylvania tolerated different religious groups and sects before the Revolution, freedom to worship elsewhere flowed from the reality of religious pluralism. Before the Revolution, most colonies supported religious institutions with public funds and discriminated in office holding against Catholics, Jews, and even some dissenting Protestants. The deep anti-Catholicism of colonial America was weakened by the Revolution. In approving a plan to invade Canada, the Second Continental Congress invited the Catholic inhabitants of Quebec to join Protestant American revolutionaries. Once the Congress formed an alliance with the Catholic nation of France in 1778, and after France proved essential to American victory, Catholics were seen as having a role in the new nation. The end of British rule led many to challenge the privileges of the established Anglican Church in several of the colonies. Revolutionary leaders such as Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton wanted to avoid the kind of religious-driven political conflict that had engulfed Europe for many centuries. While viewing religion as a necessary basis for public morality, they were also skeptics and rationalists steeped in the Enlightenment philosophy and believed in a benevolent creator, not in divine intervention in human affairs. So they were what we would call deists. This push to separate church and state united people like Thomas Jefferson and evangelical Protestants who sought to protect religion from the corruptions of government. Throughout the new United States, states deprived the established churches of their public funding and special legal privileges, and several state constitutions guaranteed the free exercise of religion. Yet religious toleration was not necessarily universal. Every state except New York retained laws which barred Jews from voting and holding office, and 7 states limited office holding to Protestants alone. Massachusetts retained its congregational establishment well into the 19th century. Catholics, however, gained the right to worship freely throughout the former colonies. Thomas Jefferson was an important figure in the advancement of religious liberty. In 1779, he wrote a bill for establishing religious freedom for the Virginia legislature. It was adopted in 1786 only after a lot of controversy. Jefferson saw established churches as tyrannies that constrained free thought, and the bill eliminated religious requirements for voting and office holding, and the government financial support also for churches. Religious liberty became a model for the revolutionary generation's definition of rights as private matters to be protected from government. In a very Christian, but not very pious United States, the separation of church and state drew a line between public authority and a private sphere in which rights existed as a limitation on government power. You see here, this is a draft of Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Bill for establishing religious freedom. It was published in 1779 in order to encourage the public discussion of the issue. The bill was enacted in 1786. While the Revolution expanded religious freedom, its emphasis on individual rights also challenged religious institutions and authority. In some churches, such as the Moravians who had migrated to America from Germany, younger members of the community insisted that they had liberty to conduct their own affairs, including arranging their own marriages. Yet by allowing for the growth of different denominations, the separation of church and state actually expanded religion's influence in American society. Anglicans, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists faced growing dissent from groups like the Baptists and the Universalists. Colonial leaders were not hostile towards religion. Separation of church and state was not as an attack on religiousness itself. Instead, religious and secular language emerged during the struggle for independence, which really created an outlook some scholars have called Christian republicanism. Most leaders of the American Revolution were devout Christians, and even deists who did not attend an organized church believed that religious values reinforced the morality required for a republic to thrive. Some states continued to bar non-Christians from public office and to prosecute people for blasphemy or violating the Sabbath. Revolutionary leaders worried about the character of citizens and especially their virtue, their ability to sacrifice their self-interest for public good, and some promoted free public schools as a way to prepare citizens for civic life of participation in government that was required of free people. You can see this sketch by Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale, Treated this in his diary on April 24th, 1783. This was shortly after the Congress ratified the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war between the United States and Great Britain. 13 stars surrounded the coat of arms of Pennsylvania, and the banner text illustrates the linkage amongst virtue, liberty, and American independence. You also see here, this is the circle of social and benevolent affections. This was an engraving in the Columbian Magazine in 1789 and shows the various admirable qualities that are radiating outward from the virtuous citizen, include love for one's family, their community, and their nation. This next section we're going to be talking about the definition of economic freedom, how that changed after the revolution, and who really benefited from these changes. Slavery was, again, only one of many kinds of unfree labor that had existed in colonial America. But after the revolution, the decline of indentured servitude and apprenticeship and the transformation of paid domestic service into a job for black and white women made unfree labor for white men increasingly rare. As wage labor became more common, and as Republican citizenship seemed more and more incompatible with the restraints of apprenticeship and indentured servitude, more white men insisted on economic freedom. By 1800, when indentured servitude had virtually ceased to exist in America, a distinction had hardened between freedom and slavery, and a northern economy based on free labor, which meant you were either working for a wage or you owned a farm or shop, and a southern economy based on slave labor. The question of what constituted the social conditions of freedom really interested Americans in the Revolutionary period. Many believed a republic could not survive with a large number of dependent citizens who were subject to the power and influence of a superior and independent men. They felt that this would then corrupt those that would be dependent upon them. Men like Thomas Jefferson saw land ownership for all white men as the key to ensuring a republican future for the nation. Many Americans thought that the abundance of land, which had been occupied by Indians, would ensure republican liberty and social equality. This is a view from Bushongo Tavern, another engraving from the Columbian Magazine in 1788. Shows the landscape of York Country, Pennsylvania, exemplifies the kind of rural independence that many Americans thought was essential for their freedom. The idea that having the land and living on the land would ensure your freedom. Now, the revolution really emphasized conflict and about whether local or national governments should ensure household independence and Americans' livelihoods by limiting price increases. In order to finance the war, Congress issued hundreds of millions of dollars in paper money. Now, combined with disruptions to agriculture and trade and hoarding by a lot of merchants who had hoped to profit from shortages, this caused an extraordinary price increases for many goods. In many areas, Americans rioted against merchants and demanded that they charge a just price. By 1779, inflation was so great that Congress asked the states to pass laws that would fix wages and prices, a move which embodied the idea that a republican government should promote the public good, not the self-interest of individuals. But some Americans argued for free trade and believed that prosperity flowed from economic self-interest. Readers of Adam Smith's treatise, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776, were influenced by his arguments that the invisible hand of the free market directed economic life more fairly and more effectively than a government could. They argued that once America's trade was independent from British control, the natural workings of the economy would ensure the nation's prosperity. So we're really seeing the debate here over how much control the government should have in the economy. This next section, we're going to be talking about how the revolution really did, in a sense, limit the freedoms, especially those of the Loyalists and of the Native Americans. Not all Americans experienced the revolution and its effects as an expansion of freedom. Individuals who maintained their allegiance to the British Crown were called Loyalists and lost a lot of their freedoms. Many Loyalists, which included men and women from all social classes, had supported resistance in the 1760s, but opposed independence and war. About 20 to 25% of free Americans were in fact loyal to the Crown during the war, and 20,000 Loyalists fought for the British. Although there were Loyalists in every county, they were most numerous in New York, Pennsylvania, and in the back country of Georgia and the Carolinas. The American Revolution kind of took on this quality of a civil war in some places. Neighbors intimidated and assaulted each other. Pacifists who refused to bear arms were arrested and their property was seized. Many states required oaths of allegiance, and those who refused were stripped of their voting rights or even expelled from their states. Some Loyalists had their property confiscated, and when the war ended, almost 100,000 Loyalists were exiled or voluntarily emigrated from the United States, many of them settling in Canada. Loyalists who stayed were reintegrated into American society. This is a 1780 British cartoon that is commenting on the cruel fate of American Loyalists. Pro-independent colonists, you see here, are likened to the savage Indians, and they are attacking those loyal to the British Crown. You can see here in this map that the Revolutionary War was in some ways a lot like a civil war within the colony. There were loyalists in every colony, again, but you can see most numerous in New York, North and South Carolina. You see the darker the pink color, the more loyal the colonists. Now the Indians particularly faced the Revolution as a loss of freedom. Between the Proclamation of 1763 and the American Revolution, colonists continued to move westward and claim Indian lands east of the Mississippi. Many leaders in the Revolution, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were deeply involved in Western land speculation and British efforts to restrain land speculation was a major grievance of the Virginians supporting independence. Different Indian tribes backed the British or the Americans in the conflict, and some tribes like the Iroquois split internally over the war and fought each other. But the Americans and their Indian enemies inflicted atrocities on each other. Both the Americans and their Indian enemies inflicted atrocities on each other and civilians. Independence created state governments that were democratically accountable to the voters who wanted Indian land. Many, like Thomas Jefferson, saw the war as an opportunity to secure more land and freedom for white Americans by expelling or conquering the Indians. The Treaty of Paris marked the end of a process whereby power in eastern North America moved from Indians to white Americans, limiting the British in eastern North America to Canada. The agreement led the British to abandon their Indian allies and recognize American sovereignty over the entire region east of the Mississippi River, disregarded the natives who lived there, and for Indians, on the other hand, freedom meant independence and possession of their own land, and they used American language of liberty to defend themselves. Next, we're going to be looking at the impact of slavery on the Revolution. Now, for African Americans, the Revolution's ideals and the war presented an opportunity for freedom. In 1776, 1/5 of the new nation's inhabitants, about 500,000 people, were slaves. Slavery was central to the language of the Revolution. Other than liberty, it was the word most often used in this era's legal and political writing. Slavery was often defined as the opposite of liberty, and it was the primary political in its meaning and signified the denial of an individual's personal and political rights by an arbitrary government. Even slave owners resisting or fighting the British expressed that they were enslaved by their enemies. By the Revolution, slavery was entrenched in every American colony. Nearly every founding father, North and South, owned slaves at some point. When writing of man's unalienable right to liberty in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson owned more than 100 slaves, all of whom made possible his pursuit of leisure and arts and sciences. Some patriots argued that slavery for blacks allowed freedom for whites by removing the dependence of poor from the political nation and giving white men economic independence. John Locke's vision of the political community as a group of individuals who contracted together to protect their natural rights was also used to defend slavery. The rights of self-government and the protection of property from the government's interference, some argued, prevented the government from interfering with their human property as well. Government intervention with their slave property, these whites complained, would make slaves of them. Advertisement. This is an advertisement for newly arrived slaves in a Savannah paper in 1774. Even as colonists are defending their own liberty against the British, the buying and selling of slaves continued. By making liberty this absolute value and defining freedom as a universal entitlement rather than a set of rights limited to a particular place or people, the revolution inevitably led to questions about slavery and its status in the new nation. Before independence, slavery was rarely discussed in public, and even though enlightened opinion had come to see the institution as immoral, inefficient, and a relic of ancient barbarism, Quakers in the late 1600s had protested slavery. In the American Revolution, many Pennsylvania Quakers had begun to oppose slavery. Only with the Revolution, however, did slavery emerge as a subject of public debate and controversy. Many slaves realized that the revolutionary definition of liberty as universal right opened the door for them to use this language to challenge their bondage. African Americans were the most persistent advocates of freedom as a universal entitlement, and they pressed revolutionary whites to follow their own principles. In the early 1770s, enslaved blacks in New England presented petitions to courts and legislatures asking Americans fighting English tyranny to end the tyranny that Americans exercised over their slaves. The war offered opportunities for escape, and the incidence of which seemed to increase during the conflict. This is a notice in the Massachusetts Spy reporting the resolution of the Committee of Correspondence in Worcester County advocating the abolition of slavery. This is a portrait of Phyllis Wheatley in 1753 to 1784 was when she lived. She is a very well-known advocate who had been brought as a slave to Boston. She learned to read and write and was a very well-known published poet. And a lot of her poems have the themes about the need for and the right to have African American freedom. Now, although about 5,000 slaves fought for American independence, by which some had gained their freedom, many more slaves had obtained their freedom by siding with the British. Several proclamations by British generals offered freedom to slaves who enlisted in the British military. Nearly 100,000 slaves, including many in Georgia and South Carolina, escaped and fled to British lines. Although by the end of the war, many had been recaptured, nearly 20,000 former slaves faced being returned to their owners, like George Washington, who insisted that they rejoin their owners. But the British refused, and many emigrated to England or to other British colonies. The Revolution momentarily seemed to threaten the perpetuation of slavery. During the war, most states banned or discouraged the further importation of African slaves, and the conflict devastated many southern plantations. In the 1780s, a significant number of slaveholders, especially in Virginia and Maryland, emancipated their slaves. This happened only very rarely in the other southern states. You can see here, this was the Book of Negroes that was compiled by British commanders when they evacuated New York City in 1783. It lists about 3,000 African Americans who looked or sought for their freedom behind British lines and departed with the British Army. Many ended up in Nova Scotia. Some eventually made their way to Sierra Leone and West Africa. And this page that we see here includes a line for a slave known as Deborah, who was the former slave of George Washington. She was sixth from the bottom, so right here. You see Deborah's entry. Between 1777, when Vermont's new constitution prohibited slavery, and 1804, when New Jersey banned slavery, every state north of Maryland moved towards emancipation. This was the first time in history that legislatures had acted to end slavery. But even in the North, slaves' importance as property shaped the way emancipation unfolded. Most northern laws allowed for gradual emancipation. Living slaves were not freed, and only the children of slave mothers would become free after serving the master until adulthood, in order to compensate for the loss of property. Many northern slave owners were just as reluctant as southerners to emancipate their slaves after the war. The Revolution had a contradictory impact on American slavery and American freedom. Emancipation in the North, however gradual, came to distinguish free from slave states. In Northern abolition, voluntary emancipation in the South, and slave escapees created a large free black communities for the first time in American history. Free black communities had their own leaders, they established their own independent churches and schools. In all new states, including Maryland, South Carolina, and Georgia, free black men who met tax-paying or property requirements were allowed to vote. Nevertheless, slavery survived the war and thrived in its aftermath. By 1790, there were 700,000 slaves in the United States, 200,000 more than had existed in 1776. You can see here, this is a tray that was painted by an unknown artist in the early 19th century. Portrays Lemuel Haynes. He was a celebrated black preacher who was very critical of slavery. Now, the last thing we're going to focus on are the Daughters of Liberty, looking at how the Revolution affected women and the status of women. During the war, women had a great contribution to the struggle for national independence. At least one woman disguised herself as a man and enlisted in the Continental Army and fought in several battles. Other patriot women protested merchants charging high prices. They made homespun goods for the army, or they passed information about the British to rebel armies, so they were spies. Other women formed ladies' associations in order to raise funds for the soldiers. The conflict pulled women into private and sometimes public political discussion. Again, most famously, Abigail Adams admonished her husband to remember the ladies when establishing the new government and rights in the new nation. Nevertheless, gender remained an important boundary of freedom in America. Independence did not change the family law inherited from Britain. Husbands still held legal authority over the body, property, and choices of their wives, while political freedom for men meant the right to self-government and consent over the political arrangements that ruled over them. For women, the marriage contract was more important than the social contract. Women's relationship to the society was mediated through her relationship to her husband. Women lacked the essential basis of political participation, autonomy that was founded on property ownership or control over one's own person. Most men considered women naturally submissive and irrational, and therefore were unfit for citizenship. Public debate in the Revolutionary era saw men's rights as natural entitlements, and women's role was viewed in terms of duty and obligation, and their rights flowed from their roles as wives and mothers. By definition, this Republican citizen was male. You can see in the 1781 cipher book, which is a book for mathematic exercises of Martha Ryan, who was a North Carolina girl. It contains images of ships, a port town, and the patriotic slogan, liberty or death. This is illustrating how women shared in the political culture of the Revolutionary era. You see here in this Keep Within the Compass. This is a late 18th century engraving showing that the happiness of a virtuous woman is found if she remains within the world of the home and family. And some of the troubles you see are awaiting her if she ventures outside of this realm. The woman appears in a space marked off by a compass, which is the instrument for drawing a circle. Use that in math, I'm sure. Now, the revolution, however, did improve the status of many women. The ideology of Republican motherhood produced by the revolution gave women the responsibility to train future citizens. Revolutionary leaders believed that the nation's morality would be developed by women within the household and the family. While it ruled out women's direct participation in politics, Republican motherhood did encourage the expansion of women's educational opportunities. It also strengthened the emerging ideal of a companionate marriage, in which marriages were cemented by affection and mutual dependency rather than male authority. The revolution also changed family structure. While slaves, as dependent on the male head of the household, remained part of the owner's family in the North, hired wage workers, replacing indentured servicemen and apprentices who had once been considered family members, were not seen as part of the household. The revolution changed the lives of all Americans. On the one hand, the right to vote expanded for white men. Bound labor among whites declined. Religious groups had greater freedoms. Blacks challenged slavery. On the other hand, Indians, loyalists, and slaves experienced revolution as a loss of freedom. Many Americans saw the revolution as a struggle for freedom with worldwide significance. The revolution inspired other fights for national independence and social equality, from the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the Latin American Wars for independence. But the struggle over the meaning of freedom within the United States continued long after the war had been won. We see here, this is a portrait of John and Elizabeth Lloyd Cadwallader and their daughter Anne. This 1772 portrait of this prominent Philadelphia businessman and his family was done by Charles Willson Peale, and it shows this emerging ideal of companionate marriage that we talked about. This is based on affection rather than the male being the authority. Okay. And our last picture, this is America triumphant and Britannia in distress. This is a very elaborate allegory representing American independence as a triumph of liberty. This is from an almanac published in Boston in 1701. The key that goes along with this, and it might be difficult to see the numbers, but I'll explain them. Number 1 is America on the far right. She's holding an olive branch of peace and invites all nations to trade with her. Number 2, this is news of America's triumph broadcast around the world. Number 3 is Britain, seated next to the devil, lamenting over the loss of trade with America. Number 4 is the British flag falling from a fortress. Number 5, the European ships in American waters. Number 6, Benedict Arnold, the traitor, is hanging himself in New York City. This didn't actually happen. He in fact died of natural causes in London in 1801.